Awesome. Okay. So I thought I would start by just kind of grounding ourselves in what the current state of play is with accessing born digital records at the National Archives. And I think actually Leontin had a better screen grab of this. So at the moment, what you would do is you would go onto our website, you would find Discovery, which is our online catalogue, and you would do a combination of searching and browsing. And hopefully you would kind of land on option A or option B. So option A is an open digital record, and option B is a closed digital record. And actually, if you look at the image for option B, you can see like there's some minimal metadata, there's a bit of a title, etc. And then you have to submit an FOI request if you wish to see this one, because it's closed under an exception, and you can sort of see that information there. If you go back to option A, which is an open record, you end up clicking through a few screens and then checking out for free a born digital record. So obviously we are providing access. We are kind of ticking that box of an archive that we need to provide access. But I think we can all agree that possibly we could do better than this. So how did we get there? How did we end up with that being the solution for access to born digital records at TNA? So it can kind of map how we got to that state by looking at the various kind of stages of our thinking towards digital records at TNA. And they map quite nicely to my personal career in the digital archiving department at TNA. So when I first started working there as a kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, newly qualified archivist, it was actually called the Digital Preservation Department. And the clue is in the name, so we were thinking very much about preservation. So we were thinking about file formats, obsolescence, media, etc., etc. And obviously that was all very good grounding, and we needed to start somewhere. And we're still using a lot of that kind of thinking and all of that work today. And then as I progressed to become a fully fledged digital archivist, we started thinking about the transfer of digital records from government departments into TNA. And we had this lovely red arrow system, which some people on the call may actually remember. So as you can see, it's like kind of workflow, it's very linear, and the last gateway is ingest and accession. And there is no further arrow about giving access, presenting, enabling use or anything like that. So this little bit here where it says ingest and accession essentially meant the previous side. So pushing it out to discovery in a very minimal way to a kind of interface that was designed purely for analog material. But, this was totally valid. We needed it. I'm not going to criticize it too much. My fingerprints are also all over this. We needed to find a way to kind of transition from transferring paper records into the archive to transferring digital records in. And so then we started moving on in our thinking. And then this little diagram in the corner is from our digital strategy, which John authored a few years ago now. And you can see that we're starting to think a little bit more. Everything is becoming a bit more nuanced and complex. We started doing a bit more digital development. And most importantly, I think for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, we started to think in terms of digital services, and not just digital services for the public and the citizen, but also digital services facing into government. So we have kind of envisioned 3 digital record services at TNA. The first of which is here on the left, which is our wonderful transfer digital record service, which is currently in beta development, and kind of takes that red arrow process from the previous slide and makes it much more user-friendly and automated and whizzy, and just hopefully is just generally a much better, more usable and scalable service. And then on the right, we have our preservation service. I need to get a better image for this, but actually this is just a little snippet from an architecture diagram. But we've had a preservation service live at TNA for a while. So we can transfer stuff, we can preserve it. Now, how do we provide better access? So that is our third kind of complementary service, which I am responsible for developing. So yeah, I'm responsible for a service that does not yet exist. So what might our first priorities be for an access service? So when I started thinking about this a month or so ago, when I was first in post, there was so many options, right? And a lot of them have been talked about today. And a lot of them have been discussed within the National Archives for a number of years. But I think what we haven't done as well is talked about them externally, and in particular to our government stakeholders. So kind of like the focus was with the Transfer Digital Record Service, I want to focus on our government stakeholders and our depositors first, because one of the things that is actually a reason for us getting away with the first slide and how actually the access we give to born digital records is not great is because we don't have very many of them yet. And I know that's a very relative number, but it's sort of, it hasn't quite reached a peak that you would think it should be compared to the public records legislation. So there's a little bit of kind of, I guess, incentivization that we might want to do in this space to start getting more digital records into the archive. And then maybe we can start to do some more of the whizzy stuff that everyone has been talking about today, and kind of get ourselves out of this chicken and egg situation we're in, where we know there's things we want to develop with it when it comes to digital, but we need to have a proper corpus of digital records to work with in order to be able to test some of these ideas and this technology. So kind of came up with two challenges. So the first challenge is, how do we give access back to digital records to the government departments themselves who transfer them to us? So we really want to test our assumptions in this space. And at the moment, I feel like there's a situation that's happening where if a government department transfers digital information to us, it kind of goes into this black hole. And it's not particularly accessible again, especially if it's a closed record. They might have to come on site at Q, sit in our computer lab. We might have to get a hard drive out, etc., etc. Not a great user experience and not very scalable. Challenge number two has been talked about a little bit by John and James in the previous session. So this is around, how do we actually provide access to open digital records for the public? So the image on the right is just a procurement exercise that we've just gone through on our digital procurement framework for the UK government. So we want to start at the beginning and do a proper discovery phase for what an access service might look like into government. So the first challenge, I think, is a little bit more simple than the second challenge. So we want to test the assumption that is ease of access to records a factor in deciding when to transfer to TNA. And so we want to ask them all kinds of questions, government stakeholders, I mean, about how they're currently accessing their records, how this might change when they move to digital, how often, what are the scenarios in which you require access to your records, who needs records, do we have to authorize access for other people across government, other inquiries, investigations, and how, so like just viewing them, downloading them, do they have to be in the original format? And how will they always know what they're looking for? Or will they need to do searches either for inquiries or other kind of questions that come their way from policy teams, etc.? And And hopefully by carrying out this piece of user research, we'll know how we can build a more efficient, timely and secure access service for our government users. And then, so this slide I think is a bit superfluous now, but before we went into challenge 2, I was going to just kind of clear up this idea about what is gradated access. So I think we can skip over this because John and James have talked about it. And this is a very simple diagram, like that's meant to show this concept of gradating access. So please don't get hung up on what's down the left-hand side and what's running across the top. All these things can be multiplied and changed and nuanced, but essentially we're talking about an attribute-based access control system. So you have people who are in different roles, you know, different actors, they are in different locations, and then along the top you have the information itself, the records themselves, and the different attributes that those records might have. And then you can see how kind of access is granted or pulled back dependent on all of those attributes, both of the information itself, but also of those who are requesting it. So the second challenge that we want to talk to our government stakeholders about, we want to test this assumption that gradating the access to the records will lessen the risk involved in transferring digital records to TNA. Because we need to transfer more records to TNA, it says so in the public records legislation, and we're getting very close to the wire with that. Providing gradated access, so will this kind of lessen the risk of blanket non-disclosure of digital records? And by that I mean kind of just marking all records closed because there's too much risk and there's too much effort involved in sensitivity reviewing them. So we'd rather just wait for people to click that FOI request button and do it on a one-by-one basis. Would, for example, choosing a certain publication format that perhaps removed some of like the internal metadata of some of the digital files, would that lessen the risk involved in transferring digital records? And will all of these things encourage departments to transfer digital records earlier, perhaps more often, or in greater volume? So there are some kind of obvious questions of things that we would like to ask in this space. You know, how do government departments view the risks and opportunities involved? I mean, we've heard a bit about that today, but I would like to ask them in a very kind of specific conversation. What do they think of this concept of gradating access? I know James sort of asked that question in the discussion just now. So yeah, we are absolutely going to talk to departments about this rather than it just being something that we do completely separately to them. And what do they think of this idea of choosing a specific publication format, such as HTML5, for example? So after we have kind of done both of those challenges, you know, then we have more digital records here and we can do anything we like and everything that everyone has been talking about today. So that's me. There are some links here that people might find useful. A fuller brief on the Access project, some digital transformation blogs, our new catalogue model, and also the digital strategy that started it all off. Yeah.
Great.